and staff, welcome to this afternoon's special meeting of Council where we consider the application for the environmental impact study for the Gowrie to Helidon section of the Inland Rail. This meeting is open to the public and will be live streamed. I would like to thank those in the room that are with us today, acknowledge those in the gallery, and acknowledge all those watching via Council's social media channels. I acknowledge the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse these lands we meet on today, the Western Waka Waka, Guyabal and Jarawat peoples, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the knowledge, rich traditions and bold ambitions of Australia's first people. Item number 2 on the agenda, councillors, is the attendance, including apologies, leave of absence, granting leaves of absence and declaration of conflict of interest. We do have a noting of a leave of absence by Councillor O'Shea and therefore don't need any resolution to accept that. I have not received any notification from Councillor Carroll, but I would assume that she'll be here as soon as she can. And likewise, the Mayor, Councillor Antonio, is also delayed on his arrival and hopefully will get here. He sends his apologies for the time being and will record those formally if that is the case by the time the meeting gets to close. So, councillors, I have no declared conflicts of interest that have been raised at this time. If there is something, of course, that crops up through the passage of the afternoon, please notify myself and other councillors if that's the case. So, councillors, we move then to item number 3, which is the Toowoomba Regional Council submission on the draft environmental impact statement for the Gowrie to Helidon section of the Inland Rail project. I just might hand over to straight to Elizabeth. Is that right? Yes, General Manager Stewart. So Senior Environmental Planner Elizabeth Reid will go through the report for us. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Councillor. Good afternoon, councillors. As Councillor McDonald has just explained, this purpose of the report is to consider Council's response on the draft environmental impact statement for the Gowrie to Helidon section of the Inland Rail. A brief overview of the project. The Inland Rail project consists of 13 individual projects with over 1,700 kilometres of rail linking Melbourne and Brisbane via regional Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. Within Queensland, there are 5 projects and 2 of which occur within the Toowoomba region. 1, the Border to Gowrie section, and number 2, the Gowrie to Helidon. Earlier this year, councillors, you might recall that we have done a technical review and provided a submission on the Border to Gowrie section. And once again, we are following that same process for the Gowrie to Helidon section. So we have set up an internal working group made up of technical officers across council, and we've also engaged the help of Range Environmental once again to help us with that technical review, particularly in the areas of air, noise, lighting, vibration, and for this one, with the tunnel, hydrogeology. So what I will do, councillors, is I will highlight some of the key issues that the team has picked up within this draft environmental impact statement. Issue number 1 relates to the Toowoomba Region Planning Scheme, and we feel that the draft EIS has failed to address and consider the local planning scheme requirements, and that the draft EIS therefore requires an update to ensure the appropriate consideration of TRC's planning scheme is included in the document. The second point, councillors, for you is that passenger rail. We feel that the draft EIS is inconsistent in its commitment to ensuring the availability and capacity to provide a high-speed passenger rail service from Toowoomba to Brisbane. And it is Council's position that this dismissal of passenger rail services should be reconsidered and the draft EIS rewritten to include the provision for the ability for the future of viable and reliable passenger rail services from Toowoomba to Brisbane.
Elizabeth, just if I could, sorry to interrupt, we might just pause after each of these items that you raise if there are any questions so we don't have to go back to them. So the first one was in regard to the planning scheme and the second of which is now around passenger rail and the capacity for the proposed tunnel to allow for passenger rail in the future. So that's what this is saying. And so we'll pause after each one in case there's any questions. Thanks, Elizabeth. Question? Thank you. Councillor Rebecca.
Thanks, Chair. On the passenger rail provisions, through you, so they haven't been provided for in the EIS, and we are arguing that yes, they should be. Where does the business case sit currently on passenger rail that could be used to justify either of those decisions?
Through you, Chair, if we could have some input.
I'd like to defer that question through to General Manager Mike Brady. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thank you, councillors. Good afternoon. As councillors aware, I'm on council's senior officer on the technical working group for passenger rail that the state kicked off earlier this year, looking into that. In regards to the business case per se for passenger rail, that's still in development as far as the work that the state's looking at doing. So they've done a couple of steps towards that as they presented somewhat recently to council. In regards to the project, as in the Inland Rail project itself, one of the requirements under the intergovernmental agreement for Inland Rail in Queensland is that this line is to enable or not preclude passenger rail. That said, the challenge here is probably more, you'll get a train up there, but anything of, inverted commas, high speed will be a challenge at the moment through, particularly from the EIS perspective, when you look at exactly what the EIS is actually commenting against, noting that a lot of the information, the EIS, is around about 2 years old, and we've got a comment specifically against that information. So a fair bit has progressed since then, but that said, in regards to the EIS, it was very limited in its consideration or dealing with passenger rail in any form. So going forward, we hope things will progress in that space, but and it's more than just the tunnel. There's quite a number of matters when it comes to Inland Rail that are going to be challenging, particularly in respect to passenger rail.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks, Chair. So the bottom line is we're not asking for it to be ruled in at this point. We're just, in this EIS, we're saying don't explicitly rule it out.
Oh, no, we're going to the extent of saying we want high-speed rail, make sure it works for high-speed rail.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, that's our recommendation to the Coordinator General. Where the Coordinator General takes it, we'll have to all wait and see. Thanks.
So it's about future-proofing for high-speed rail in the tunnel. That's what this submission is about.
Not just the tunnel, okay? High-speed rail is a lot more than the tunnel issues, okay? There's both our end, being the Gowrie Junction end, if we are going to have passenger rail, there's a fair bit to happen in that space there. And then this is, inverted commas, our commentary on Gowrie to Helidon. So even on the eastern side of the range, there's challenges there as well. So it's we're asking that, and we don't want a service like we've got today. You know, council doesn't want that. A lot would argue that we've got a 4.5 hour, 5 hour passenger rail train trip to Brisbane. We don't want that. We want something that would see this community grow into the future and in between. So,
just if you wouldn't mind staying there, Mike, there's a couple of questions. Councillor Tim, Councillor Megan and Councillor Nancy.
Thanks, Chair. So I just wanted to pick up on your words here. You said at all, it's not doing passenger rail at all. I was under the impression that they were looking at options around how we use the same tracks, and we're saying we want a whole other dedicated track?
No,
or are you saying it's not included at all?
No, I'm sorry if I may have caused a misunderstanding there. We're not asking for a dedicated new track. We're asking for the capability of the track that is constructed and the associated infrastructure, tunnels and other elements, to ensure that it is quite capable for taking high-speed passenger rail. But, you know, I'll give you one example of one of the major challenges is just the signalling system. Okay, the high-speed rail is, say, 160 kilometres an hour and a freight train speed is 110 or 120 kilometres an hour. Totally different signalling requirements for those two different speeds. So when I talk about other issues, there's all sorts of elements of that go into making this track available for passenger rail.
Thanks.
That's right, Councillor Tim. Councillor Megan, then Councillor Nancy.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Mike, how much consistency has there been across the whole project in terms of requesting capability for high-speed rail? Do you know?
In respect to passenger rail, is that your question?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, passenger rail. The current study under the intergovernmental agreement is the Toowoomba to Brisbane passenger rail study. So all the councils between here and Brisbane are similarly have offices similarly to myself that are part of the working group. So from a consistency point of view, and there's quite a number of other people that, from the working group perspective, there's probably 20 to 30 people in that working group from different departments and the consultants and etc. And our officers also work very closely with Strat Planning, Michelle and team, and our transport and drainage planning team as well are very involved, as is Craig with the Inland Rail project itself.
Let's answer your question. Enough? Happy enough with that? Councillor Nancy?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Mike. So I just wondered, Mike, given where the tunnel comes out, that's why the focus is on Gowrie Junction, I'm assuming. So if there were to be, into some stage into the future, a fast rail, at whatever fastness that is, excuse me, to Gowrie Junction, so anybody wanting to catch that to go to Brisbane would have to go out to Gowrie Junction, would they, or...?
I suppose that's not confirmed at this point in time as far as the study is concerned. Obviously, the issues from Gowrie Junction into town is that the train speed is around about a 40 kilometre per hour limit. So that's 20 minutes from Gowrie Junction into here. There's also then, okay, so if you know, when it looks at it, when the passenger rail side of things develops further, there's an obvious thought, obviously, that somewhere out Gowrie Junction or thereabouts or somewhere out there, there may need to be consideration to another station being part of that project.
So given that, it would put a very strong argument towards it only going as far as Withcott, really, wouldn't it?
Not necessarily. I mean, there is arguments to do it in stages and things like that. But, you know, what is the future of this city? You know, it's going to grow to, over the next 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years, you know, we're going to have well over a couple 100,000 people here. And I think, you know, if you could get a service from Brisbane to Toowoomba under 2 hours, that would be probably a very beneficial outcome for this community in the decades ahead. It's not going to happen overnight, I grant you that, and, you know, they may do it in stages or there might be certain improvements done at certain times, but, you know, going into the years ahead, if we look at this being a little bit visionary as a council community.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. But what I'm getting at is, you know, sure, there will be opportunity for a fast rail at some stage, and its justification, though, of taking it all the way out to Gowrie Junction, if you look at if we work on just from the CBD, all the way out to Gowrie Junction versus just going to Withcott, the justification for the increased infrastructure required in the tunnel would be very difficult to justify, is my thought.
Yeah, look, I suppose that's fine as an opinion.
So I gather this is a submission on the EIS that's been provided, and so the officers have put together this through assistance with consultants as to what our desire would be for our community. So that would be the desire. It then goes through the Office of Coordinator General, and how it ends up is, probably out of our hands to a degree. Michelle, did you want to add further context to that from a strat planning perspective?
I just wanted to clarify that with the EIS, there are a set of terms of reference that are established at the beginning of the project that the proponent needs to respond to. And so our review of the EIS has been to consider those terms of reference and the consideration of a high-speed passenger rail, and passenger rail was actually contained within the terms of reference, which was set by the Coordinator General. So there's a requirement for the proponent to consider those aspects. In reviewing the information provided, the officers have identified that that aspect has not adequately been considered and therefore does not adequately address the terms of reference. The broader strategic context that the General Manager is referring to is in relation to passenger rail, which is also a adjoining case study. And there are broader strategic opportunities in linking potentially Gowrie Junction, should that be an identified station as part of that study, potentially back into the CBD and back into our transport network. So there are some broader strategic elements to that, but I think the point that I'm really wanting to advise here is that the terms of reference are set down by the Coordinator General. We have reviewed the terms of reference and considered that these are areas that we're identifying don't adequately address the terms of reference, and then to provide the supporting reasons behind that in relation to our local regional council area.
Thanks, Michelle. So we're comfortable to move on to the next item. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you. So the next item that we will be talking to this afternoon is that ARTC, the proponent, has only adopted a 10-year development horizon for the proposed project, and this does not take into account Council's future planning for Gowrie Junction and our northern communities, and we feel that a much longer design horizon out to 2050 and beyond would be more appropriate in that instance.
Just pausing there for a moment. Councillor Carl?
It's a broader question about the adopted horizon. Can someone refresh my memory as to who set the terms of reference for the EIS?
So the Coordinator General has set the terms of reference for the environmental impact
So
statement.
I guess the second part of that question would be, how did their office, the Office of the Coordinator General, procure the information that fed into setting the terms of reference? What stakeholders were engaged to ensure that, it was suitable for a 10-year horizon or a 20 or a... Do we know that?
I don't believe that the design horizon was actually a part of the terms of reference. This is something that the proponent has actually...
Yeah, I guess we're talking about that section, but my question is broader, and it goes back to the nub of how these EISs are formulated. My question is, I want to understand how all those bits are pulled together, how we procure from the relevant stakeholders or the Coordinator General's office procures all of that information to set a reasonable EIS. Do we know that, or are we just at the end of the food chain?
So there is a public consultation period associated with the terms of reference. So the Coordinator General, I'm unsure of the process that happens before that, but when the terms of reference is drafted, we were able to make public comment on that terms of reference before that terms of reference was finalised for the project.
Okay, that's clarified that. Any other questions in regard to that horizon? Thanks, Elizabeth.
So the next point here relates to local employment and accommodation. And we want to highlight for the Coordinator-General and the Office of the Coordinator-General that the region is currently experiencing record low unemployment rates and vacancy rates for accommodation, and that the draft environmental impact statement discusses sourcing construction workers locally, thereby assuming there will be no requirement for accommodation to be sourced by the proponent. And we would like to point out that that is obviously missing some critical information, and it's not taking into account current data and current knowledge of our housing accommodation and also our local unemployment rates.
So, Elizabeth, just in regard to that, this EIS started some time ago, 2017 or thereabouts. So obviously there's quite a different market from an employment perspective, accommodation perspective that it is now. How do we have, or can we, do we have a say in how current the data is that's being used to formulate these ideas of local employment accommodation? Can we put anything in an EIS to stipulate a time period or whatever?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So what we have done in order to stipulate a time period and to ensure that the proponent is using more accurate data around employment and accommodation is to draft a condition for the Coordinator-General to have a look at, which states that 6 months prior to construction, this needs to be reached with an agreement with TRC, so that a discussion is to be had around this issue. We've also placed some other recommendations in there around perhaps the proponent needs to look into workers' camps or even providing actual long-term accommodation, building and constructing long-term accommodation for their workforce that could then actually remain as part of our housing accommodation availability.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Any questions in regard to that section? Thanks. Next one.
So this next one is on construction water, and councillors, this may be a familiar topic to you because for the Border to Gowrie section of the Inland Rail, we did have quite an in-depth discussion around this, and council officers did go away and actually draft some very specific wording that we included in the Border to Gowrie submission, and that same wording has been used here. And what it does is it refers, the draft EIS refers to TRC water sources as being available for construction water source purposes, and that we will reiterate our position that all water sources, be they raw, potable, surface or bore water, used to supply all Toowoomba region communities, are not available for construction of Inland Rail by the proponent or its contractors. So we have very clearly stated that in the cover letter of our submission and also in the various points referring back to the draft EIS sections.
So this was, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, this was quite some effort put in at the last one, Border to Gowrie, and that's the wording we landed on, was it, for that one?
That's correct.
Are there any questions in regard to that, councillors? Councillor Carl?
Just a comment, if I may, Chair. This goes to the heart of my question before. It questions the integrity of the terms of reference set by the Coordinator-General's office. It appears glib to me personally, my personal opinion, that it gets put out for public comment when we quite clearly see here that our officers have never changed their position on this. So at some point, they would have had to have spoken, or surely you would think they would have spoken to our officers. And if that view hasn't changed, then that's why I question the integrity of the procurement stage of this EIS being put together. But here we are at the other end being asked to make a submission and our position hasn't changed. It's pretty poor, to be blunt.
General Manager Stuart Summers might just mention something.
I'm a bit unsure how you're using the term procurement, because the Coordinator-General doesn't actually procure or...
No, I'm not using it in the sense of purchasing. I'm saying it in a broader sense of making sure that the relevant stakeholders were consulted properly before the community consultation phase. And that obviously appears to me to be the case because our officers have not changed their position.
Well, I guess, I think that's alluded to in our submission, but we could probably make that a bit clearer that we are disappointed with the lack of response to our initial comments on the EIS that was sent out, the draft EIS, but it's the contract, it's the rail constructor that does the EIS itself. And, but certainly, yes, the state government sets the hurdles up that the consultants and the rail constructor have to jump over. So, you know, it looks like Michelle wants to comment as well.
Thank you. I think I understand the matter a little bit more now, so thank you, Councillor Carl. It doesn't prevent the proponent from still continuing community engagement and consultation with a range of stakeholders during this process. But as alluded to, the terms of reference were initially set down in 2017. It's taken quite a bit of time for the proponent to get to this point, and this is their response, but they would still be having ongoing discussions with both ourselves and other members of the public. From our perspective, though, in terms of water sources, yes, Councillor Carr, we have consistently reinforced with ARTC that Toowoomba water sources are not available for construction. So on that particular aspect, yes, we do believe that they haven't appropriately considered those comments.
You're right, Councillor Carl? Okay. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you. So the next point here is relating to the impact on our local government road network. And we have noted that the draft EIS identifies several changes to road rail interfaces, consolidations, diversions and closures of local roads, none of which are considered appropriate for the community, as they will adversely impact the road network and significantly increase congestion in areas which are already experiencing large volumes of traffic. So Council has not, at the time of putting together this submission, agreed in principle or otherwise with any of the proposed changes to these road rail interfaces or consolidations, diversions or closures of local roads proposed.
Councillors, any questions in regard? Councillor Megan?
Thanks, Mr Chair. I'm not sure, Elizabeth, did you have anything to do with the EIS, with the second range crossing?
No, I did not, Councillor.
Maybe it's a question for General Manager Mr Brady. I was just curious to know whether this is kind of a fairly standard starting point with these major projects, and then it's accepted that you reach an agreement, I guess.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Councillor Harris-Allen. The EIS for second range crossing was done probably a good 10 years plus before the actual project. So it was done, I think, in the early 2000s, if I remember correctly, when they took the corridor and gazetted the corridor and did all that. So that was done probably 15 years before the project actually went through, and I think they did a bit of a refresh just before the construction actually happened. Yeah, so that said, one of the situations here, as I've already mentioned, well, there's a couple of points. One is we have to comment this is in some ways a little unusual, the process here. A lot of times major projects, e.g. a second range crossing, it's done in sequence. So there's time between a lot of these things happening and each phase of a project. Here, the federal government's come in and is doing a lot of this in parallel. So at the same time that they're doing the EIS, they're also doing, further design work and further development of the project, and in fact are going through the procurement of the contractor as we speak. So, which means that a lot of our commentary is difficult to be taken on board in our discussions with their officers, because it's us asking for something to them, whereas in a normal project, you've got the EIS, it's already set the parameters of what can happen and what's allowed and what's not, and the project goes into the design phase from that point on. This is all happening all at the same time, which is quite challenging for the team and for ourselves. So with that in mind, this is what what we're sort of, our commentary has to be focused in on is what's in front of us, but noting that we've told them. The other aspect to this that I was also going to mention is the type of contract they're going into, which is a PPP contract. So a lot of their response to us is that that'll be sorted out by the contractor. Okay, the proponent will come up with the best way to get water. The proponent will come up with the best way to deal with the local roads. The proponent will work out where the housing and everything is. We're saying, well, that's not really good enough, be it the water, be it the roads, be it the housing. So we're being quite strong within our response to the EIS that that's not satisfactory.
I mean, does it, Mr.
Follow-up?
Chair, I mean, it does seem a bit sort of, you know, whatever comments we're making, are they a bit redundant, really?
No,
If the
Probably
process is happening in
yeah.
parallel, it's already happening, and
I say absolutely not, because there's numerous matters that they are saying, oh, we'll have to wait the outcome of the EIS. So I think from our perspective and our discussions at a government level is that it's very, very important for us to be very clear and have clarity around exactly what we want. The more clarity that we can give into the process at this point, as much as the difficulties and challenges of putting all this together has been, the better chance we have of actually getting, you know, better community outcomes. Yeah.
Any other, Councillor Melissa?
Thank you, Chair. This might be for you, Mike. I beg your indulgence if this is mentioned somewhere else, but just while we're talking about the local road network, just in those two paragraphs there, it doesn't mention anything about the state of the road or the return of the state of the road after the project. So, I mean, we want our roads, if they've got heavy vehicles on them, through that project to be returned to, you know, a better, well, same state or better state than when they commenced the project. So,
Yeah. Probably refer you, just for information only, potentially, is item 20, I think it's on page 26 of the EIS document itself. But that goes into our response in respect to the road network connectivity and related road matters. In respect to the point that you've asked in regards to haulage routes and the like, that is also addressed in the EIS document, and I think, I'm sorry, I can't remember the clause number that's in, but it's probably towards the back of that document. We're also, I've talked about all these things happening in parallel. The other thing that's happening in parallel is the interface agreements that we're doing with on the upstream and downstream interface agreements, and they go into a lot more detail in respect to ensuring that principle that any return of asset, be it the roads or whatever, is returned to us in the same, if not better, our state than when they start, and that's particularly true for haulage roads. So a lot of work goes into that aspect, and we're also, another clause in there is a deterioration adjustment payment to council, which will be taken on board as well.
okay, thank you.
That's okay, Councillor Melissa. You've got your information there. Thank you. Mike, anything else you'd like to add in regard to... Thanks, Councillor Rebecca. Anything else you'd like to add in regard to this area? I know that certainly briefings we've had as a council that, you know, this has been one of those sticking points of negotiations, I guess, to this point. And this is our opportunity as a council for the first time publicly to actually put out the fact that the amount of work that officers have been doing in negotiation to getting a good outcome for our community. So I guess it's important from us as elected representatives to explain our support behind you guys doing this work, but more importantly on behalf of the community. So is there anything in particular that you'd like to raise from a road network that we should be aware of at the moment?
I suppose there's a lot of conversations continuing, and we've written some letters back just even in August, I think July, August, which really pointed to some of the issues in respect to what we considered we were looking at in respect to what was coming back to us in regards to road connectivity. We've made it pretty clear from the highest levels in council to, that we weren't satisfied. That has probably, which has been a positive step forward from our perspective, and to their credit, Inland Rail are taking that on board and starting to consider how they can give. I said it's our road network. When I say our road network, our community's road network. We're the ones that know how best it should be managed and if you're going to bring this project through, how best it can be mitigated, those impacts. It's, in essence, about time you start listening and take that on board, please. And I suppose that's, we've put that through quite strongly in our correspondence. So that is starting to get some traction. So going forward, I've got some confidence that we should get something a little bit more positive happening in this space. Time will tell, obviously.
So, Mike, if the response has been, you alluded to it earlier, that the proponent will do this, the proponent will do that through the Triple P process, is there opportunities for this council then to meet with the proponents or officers?
I'd have to say very unlikely.
Which is a little different to the bypass, second range crossing.
The decision on the proponent is not. Our small amount of work is so minuscule, somewhat, in the dollar terms of how this this project might go forward. That the decisions on which proponent and how this all goes forward at the end won't involve too much from council.
All right, thank you. Any other questions around the roads for Mike? If not, Elizabeth will move to the next one. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, councillors.
Which is around local supplies. Yeah.
That's correct. Thank you, Councillor. So our next critical issue that we're identifying here is that the draft EIS provides no focus or commitment in relation to providing real opportunities to members and businesses of the local community, and as such fails to meet the requirements of the terms of reference. And as part of our submission, we have included a recommendation that the proponent take on board the 75% that was used within that second range crossing project.
Excellent. Any questions in regard to that? Or that's reflective of a good outcome from the second range crossing, so yeah, which was over that, which is great. Thank you. We move to the next one.
So the next one, Council, is referring to groundwater hydrology, and the proposed project includes a tunnel which may breach and potentially drain an aquifer which TRC use to source our town water. The draft EIS fails to provide any mitigation measures or commitments regarding the loss of this town water from the aquifer, including but not limited to detailing any intention to capture, reuse or relocate groundwater which drains into the tunnel either during the construction or the operation of the Inland Rail. So this issue was picked up relatively late in the piece by some of our technical officers within council, and we did decide to go externally via Range to have a hydrogeologist come on board and investigate this issue a little further for us and provide some more information around the issue.
So thank you, Elizabeth. Questions in regard to this? This is a big one, I would think. Councillor Bill?
Comment, then a question. And it's probably a bit crystal ball at this stage, the question, because I don't expect any of our officers to answer it, but it is an answer that, it's a question that begs answering, because it'll impact us all in the future. And that is around our water cycle. We heard that there's strong pushback from our officers around any form of use from our sources at the moment. But here we are, we've got 1,700 meg going to run out the tunnel and not be captured in any way, shape or form, possibly contamination of an aquifer too with diesel. and all sorts of other things that'll happen in the tunnel from trains. But it begs, it's beyond belief that you can cut through an aquifer and its town water supply, part of our water cycle. We are already at our limits on yield from our water cycle for potable water, and particularly in summer, the summer part of the year. And with increased population, we are actually going to have to refocus where we draw that additional water from over the long term. So any impact on our water cycle is critical. So what that equates to for not just this community but those in the future is a dollar amount indefinitely to perhaps pump more water up the hill, because we are losing out on part of our water cycle here. So, I mean, they need to consider the impacts to this community, not just now, but from when this tunnel goes in, forever.
I think that's why it's in the submission. But Elizabeth, would you like, I noticed Phil's in the room. Phil, would you like to make comment in regard to this? I can only just assume that you've been the technical officer advising of this, so it'd be great to hear from you. And I know Councillor Nancy's got a question as well. Would you like Phil to talk first, Councillor Nancy? Thank you. Thanks, Phil. You may answer the question with you.
Afternoon, councillors. Look, the technical, there's been a few people involved in the technical advice on this. We don't have any hydrogeologists in council, but we have enough people who could read the document and the modelling that was provided, and it sort of drew a few shudders with some of the assumptions that were being made. And I know Elizabeth has got a critique come back from the hydrogeologist, a draft, I believe. It's not what you describe complementary by any means. There are major holes in the modelling that's been done. The 1,700 megs that they talk about, I would anticipate the bulk of that would be during construction, but Council Bill is correct, there will be ongoing. The impact of that, and again I may be preempting the report here, won't be right across all our domestic bores, urban bores, because they are scattered around town, as you know. They're not all directly located around the tunnel location. Having said that, it is in the basalts. The basalts are a cracked aquifer, so the rocks are cracked. There's no what you'd call clear flow patterns. So if there is a drawdown somewhere, there is a possibility that they will find a pathway back to that drawdown. And again, I'm sure that the hydrogeologist will be able to detail that a lot more than I can. In the longer term, yes, I agree with Councillor Bill, there is a potential for some loss which has not been defined. I'm not sure how significant that is, but again, we are in a position, as I know there's been quite a bit of discussion about water treatment plants and future strategies, etc., in these chambers about water supply. We are reaching a point soon where we will be at the limit of our resource. So anything that may impact is not a good thing. Can we recompense that through a monetary thing? If that's the only option available to us, but of course I think we'd all prefer to have the water going forward. So that's probably a very quick summary of where it's come from and the thoughts that have been in the head. Have I missed anything there, Paul? In the heads of the technical staff, and very much why we were very relieved when Elizabeth said she could get a hydrogeologist in to do the specialist work for us and really critique the model, which needs a fair bit of tweaking. So,
Councillor Nancy?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Bill, and good to have Paul in the room as well. So, you know, they've actually even mentioned the 1,700 megalitres. They've actually quoted a number. Lord knows what it really is. And that's beside the point. The point is we have a limited finite resource there, and we have water security to 2047 or 48 at this point in time, and that reduces that. And so we need to make sure that we can protect our water to the nth degree, and I fear saying that we're going to pump more from Wivenhoe to make up for it, because that's just robbing Peter to pay Paul. We need to ensure that we keep our current water supplies. The thought of losing such a precious resource through this process is quite alarming when we live on top of a mountain. And so I'm very keen to make this a very forceful message that we don't lose a drop.
That'd be greatly appreciated, Councillor. I suppose just as a point of clarity too, and this, sorry, Stuart. Just as a point of clarity, and you're dead right, do we know that 1700 megs is correct? Given that we've had to bring somebody in to check the modelling, it does raise some concerns, shall we say. And it doesn't define if there's going to be an ongoing loss as well. Now, fair enough, I'm sure they will work to seal the aquifer and do what they can do, but, and you know, Mike's been in this game, tunnels leak. So that's the nature of the beast. So, yes, if you wish to make that as strong as possible, Councillor, I'm certainly happy.
Thank you, Phil. And Elizabeth, I guess that's a construction water, groundwater as well, so they tie in to make a strong statement there. I guess if there's, is there anything else you'd like to ask or add, Councillor Nancy, in regard to that?
I guess, Elizabeth, I'm seeking your advice in, do you think we have put a strong enough message in relation to our precious resource, and that every drop does count, and that's our current, oh, well, no, it was our, we've changed it recently, but it was our campaign, but it is. Every drop counts, and so we need to make sure that we don't lose a drop in this whole process. Our water security to 2047-48 is in limbo based on what they've provided here.
Thank you, Councillor.
So sorry, Elizabeth. So do you feel that the wording that we have proposed in here is strong enough, or does it need reinforcing in some way?
Thank you, Councillor. If I may, Chair, I might actually call upon Lucas Talbot from Range Environmental. He's been working relatively closely with the hydrogeologist and will be able to provide a bit more of an oversight of some of those technical comments, and I'm hoping will provide an opinion as to whether or not it is strong enough, but I can assure you it is upfront in the cover letter to the Coordinator General, and it is throughout the draft environmental impact statement. Wherever there is a mention of water, we have been very clear and very strong in saying that we have some major concerns, and that once again there needs to be an agreement reached with TRC a minimum of 6 months prior to construction on any of these large issues.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Lucas, would you like to just add some context to this as well? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. All right, just to quickly walk you through the process that we've been through so far surrounding groundwater. So like Elizabeth mentioned, we've had a hydrogeologist join the team at TRC's request. Once TRC came to terms with some of the information in the EIS, obviously sought some external expert advice and opinion on the matter. So the hydrogeologist we had has 20 years experience, very knowledgeable, very skilled in the field, and has had a good look through the documentation that's been provided by the proponent. I guess with sort of a common theme we've seen through some of the different studies, I guess the first point of concern that we have is the lack of current and detailed ground surveys that were undertaken. So the tunnel goes through quite a complex groundwater system. We have the main range volcanics, which is where most of TRC's water supply bores tap. Then there's a deeper formation called the Kukandawi, and there's other aquifers as well. But the one I'll sort of talk about this afternoon a little bit is the main range volcanics, because that's the one of most interest to TRC regarding water supply. So I guess one of the first issues is the fact that there's been very little ground truthing and field surveys undertaken to try and understand what are the properties of the aquifers that we're dealing with. And like Phil mentioned earlier, we have fractured basalts, which can be quite complex to understand. And at the moment, we don't feel that there's nearly enough, real data to understand the system that we're dealing with, to then be able to predict the impacts and actually understand the predicted water loss and other things that will be a consequence of tunnelling through the system. To give you an idea of context, I spoke to a colleague today who's working on a tunnel project in Melbourne. It's a 9-kilometre tunnel, and they had sort of 300 plus groundwater bores through various phases of the project. This is a 6-kilometre tunnel that has had 12 bores installed that were monitored once back in 2018, and some of those bores were dry. So our interpretation is that the work that's been done to actually understand the system that they're going to be interfering with is not close to being adequate. To be able to make substantial calls around design of the tunnel, around how water is going to be managed, we don't feel it's nearly good enough. So that's sort of the first point of conflict. And that just sort of feeds on through the relevant, the remaining processes of the groundwater assessment. So from there, if you don't understand what you're dealing with, then your conceptual model, which you use to build your predictive model, is flawed to begin with. Without doing the right field assessment, you don't understand the groundwater parameters, so your modelling can be out. So we have concerns around the modelling that's been done. We don't believe it's actually appropriate for the EIS. And the proponent admits itself that the groundwater modelling is still being similar to what was mentioned earlier. They're still doing refinements in the background to help improve the understanding of groundwater systems and impact. So our concern is that we be given a draft EIS to comment on, but the proponent's still chipping away in the background, working on stuff. So we're not given the full picture to comment on. This is the issue with this project where things are running in parallel. We've done a draft EIS. The field studies are several years old. We're given that to comment on. In the background, there's more work that's happening. In parallel to that, you've got a contract that's being tendered and let at the moment. So that's some of the concerns we have. And I guess the other concern we have, that we believe the assessment's not good enough to understand the impacts. A lot of the work is then being pushed to detailed design, which gets pushed onto the construction contractor, who's going to be required to undertake, or we believe, significant studies that will be needed to actually assess the impacts and understand how they're going to manage the system going forward. So we kind of feel like it's the responsibility of the opponents being pushed further down the track to the PPP contractor, when really that work should be done now, not delayed till later on, when we believe that the horse is bolted then. If the approval's given, then you're relying on whatever happens later in the process. How does that get managed? How does that get regulated? So our concern, I guess with the EIS in general, is that approach that's been taken around, we do what we can now and push the rest of it to detailed design. We just don't think that's an adequate way of dealing with it, and we don't think that's fair on the community to be able to comment, and we don't believe that's fair on the Coordinator General to have to deal with, to make decisions on the project with the information they have at hand, which won't be complete because it's going to be pushed to later in the project. That's a bit of a general opening. Just around groundwater itself and just some of the numbers that were mentioned. So yes, their estimates around the construction phase with the tunnel is that it'd be 1,700 megalitres is what they're anticipating is going to come out of the tunnel. Now about half of that, so 850 meg, is going to come out of the main range volcanics. And at the moment, to give you an idea of that 850 megs, that's nearly 300 Olympic swimming pools worth of water will come out during construction that they'll need to find some way of managing. So that's construction phase. That's 850 meg over 4 years. And yes, you're right, when the tunnel is built, it will be waterproof the best they can. They don't want water in the tunnel, but water will still be having to be managed throughout the life of the tunnel. And at the moment, the forecast from the EIS is that there's 85 megalitres a year that's going to come out at Gary Junction. 85 megalitres a year is 34 Olympic swimming pools that at the moment, the proposal is to put it down Gary Creek. That doesn't come close to aligning with Queensland government policy, which has a hierarchy around wastewater management, which is sort of the reduce, reuse, disposal, which is what they're proposing, is the last preferred option. So we don't believe that's nearly appropriate.
Lucas, just picking you up there, can you just explain that a little bit further? So they're taking, or potentially taking water out of one aquifer with the seepage into the tunnel, putting it into another water system. Therefore, there must be an ecological impact somewhere where that water would normally be. That's the concern that you guys are raising? Is that the main concern?
I guess the main one for us, the concern primarily at the moment is around water resources and the loss of that, 30 Olympic swimming pools worth of water a year going down Gary Creek. That's sort of the first concern. The second concern is that the system they're putting into it it's called an ephemeral stream. So it means it's normally dry and now it will become permanently wet. It'll be constantly flowing. So yes, there's an ecological consideration. In different species and animals and whatnot, acclimatise, they're adapted to having a creek that's normally dry and then flows during rainfall events, not something that runs all year round. So at the moment, the management of water at the western end of the portal that's in the EIS is to take that 85 megalitres a year and divert it to the Gary Creek catchment.
And the submission suggests that it sounds, the first preamble that you said earlier was around the process of time frame from the study that's being procured now or about to go out around flooding and what have you for that area.
Yep.
And then this is happening in concert, yet the decision to go down the EIS potentially could happen before the studies are done.
Yes, well, a lot of the more detailed studies are being pushed to later on. And it's sort of having it in a final EIS, but that means that the community doesn't get to comment on it.
Okay.
So what we're hoping to see is that, I guess, given some of the significant issues that have been highlighted by Elizabeth earlier, the Coordinator General has the ability to request the proponent to go and review the EIS and then put it back out for public comment again. So that's what we would like to see. We don't want to see the comments go in and then the Coordinator General conditions it or whatnot. If it's going to proceed, then we'd like to see a second round of public commentary to make sure that Council's comfortable with any changes that are made and commitments in that regard.
Okay. Councillor Megan?
Thank you, Mr Chair. I mean, just that knowledge of putting that water down the creek just sounds incredible. Not incredibly good, incredibly bad. But, I mean, this might be a crazy question. Is there any way that can be re-injected into aquifers anywhere else?
Potentially, because that would come down to having quite a detailed understanding of the groundwater system, which presently we don't have. So aquifer re-injection could be something that could be considered, or is it a case of capturing it and somehow augmenting TRCs, surface water storages or whatnot? So certainly at the point we'll be pushing in the EIS is that if that water is going to be intercepted, then there needs to be a beneficial use that's identified, not putting it down Gary Creek. So whether it's through aquifer re-injection or storage or whatnot, we don't want to see every drop counts. We don't want to see it lost. It needs to be accounted for.
So just in regard to that, you're comfortable, obviously, with what the submission is to cover off on those concerns?
Yes, at the moment. I mean, we can certainly make it stronger. We can have a look at that and just make sure. Obviously, it's good to get council sentiment on the issue and make sure that it is strong enough.
Well, Councillor Summerfield?
Thank you. If I could just do a follow-up, I appreciate that. I think that would be a good thing. Just listening to what you're saying and reading in there too, where sentences didn't make sense, it was obviously rapidly thrown together, this whole document, and so not our side of it, but the EIS itself. So I'm just wondering, given what you were just saying then about how parallel work's going on while you're dealing with this document, will we get another chop at it?
That's what we're hoping. So the process from here is the comments from the community go back in on Monday. They go to the Coordinator General. If the Coordinator General believes there's a need to ask the proponent for more information, which I'd imagine there will be, they'll request more information from the proponent to clarify these issues. And the Coordinator General, if they feel that it's in a position that it's they can't really condition or approve, they can send it back out to so we can repeat the process. So that it's up to the Coordinator General from this point. But they can come back for further consultation. So they might be sent away to review certain parts of it. They might say, parts 1, 2 and 3 need to be looked at again. We're not happy. Then it can be put back out to the community for consultation again.
Thanks, Lucas.
Councillor Carl?
It just sounds like the classic case of building the plane while you're flying it. For those of us who've been around here long enough, it was a catch cry some years ago. Doesn't necessarily, and that's a real concern that they the Coordinator General may see fit to condition some of these aspects, and yet we, council, because we're part of the community, we will actually be precluded from any further comment. It's too late then.
Yeah, we've made a specific comment in the response. The response is several hundred points long, but there's a specific point around the fact that we don't agree with the approach of doing a bit now, running this in parallel, pushing this to detailed design. If they're seeking true engagement and I guess the community deserves the opportunity to have a fair say on it, then you should be given the full information, not something that is going to continue to be worked on in the background and refined. It's just, it's not, I guess, how it would normally work.
Thank you. Any other questions in regard to that area? If not, we'll continue then to the next, Elizabeth, which is the Indigenous cultural heritage.
Thank you, Chair. So the next point here, Indigenous cultural heritage. The main point that we wanted to raise was that the actual study area that was used to identify areas of Indigenous cultural heritage and potential impacts, we feel is far too narrow and appears to only encompass the rail corridor only. And obviously we've pointed out that construction impacts, lay down areas outside of that actual rail corridor may impact areas of Indigenous cultural heritage, and therefore they have not met the draft terms of reference, and more work would need to be done in that space.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Any questions in regard to that? Councillor Carl?
Yeah, I was obviously going to have a question about this one. What are they, under the cultural heritage management plans, what's the process for inevitably finding artefacts? What's the process with that?
So that would depend if it's at construction stage or whether it's at this draft environmental impact stage where they're doing desktop assessments and technical assessments.
That's exactly why I'm asking, because I fear that it won't alter anything, but it would be nice to think that it could. So, yeah, there's two different approaches up to those
That's correct,
stages.
yeah. And underneath the Cultural Heritage Act, there is an actual process for stop work if these areas of Indigenous cultural heritage are found during the construction process. I'm unsure of how that works in terms of at this draft EIS level.
Thanks.
Any other questions in regard to that item? If not, we'll move to then flora and fauna.
So in terms of flora and fauna, we have noted in our submission that the draft EIS defaults straight to offsets as a way to combat potential impacts to our unique flora and fauna of the region. And we feel that this requires amendment to further describe and clarify the commitment to avoid in the first instance. And then if avoidance is impossible, then to try and mitigate those issues against the environment before going to offsets. Offsets, we believe, should be a last resort in that instance. We also note that desktop assessments completed by the proponent have identified many habitats critical to the survival of species and which are present or in the vicinity of the proposed alignment. So we do note that there's areas of sensitive environmental values, including the top of the range, where there is a large laydown area proposed, and this is approximately 400 metres in size and does include some sensitive environmental values being our escarpment vegetation and core koala habitat area mapped by the state as well.
Any questions in regard to that area? Are there any other species, Elizabeth, that were identified or have been identified in this early stage that council should be made aware of?
So koalas are obviously one, and it's my understanding as well that some of the proposed hydrological changes will impact the species of platypus down the range.
Sorry, what's that, Councillor Carroll?
Sorry, Mr Mayor, Mr Chair, I'm trying to stay awake over here. Sugar gliders are on there as well.
Sugar
Would be
gliders.
those sorts of things, all those types of creatures.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, no other questions there. We'll move to the next item, air and noise.
So there were a number of different air and noise impacts that were identified in our council submission, but two that I just wanted to draw your attention to this afternoon was that the air assessment fails to consider the existing emissions from and on several sources, including the Toowoomba Bypass and the Harlexton Quarry, Bailey Henderson Hospital. And in terms of noise, that the potential for sleep disturbance has been grossly underestimated. And this was one of those points that we also raised in our Border to Gary submission, that the modelling and the guidelines that they use is not picking up all of those sensitive receptors that would be impacted by the noise.
Councillor Carr?
Yeah, through your chair, do you feel as though we've adequately covered off on the extractor stacks from the tunnel? Because my lay person's understanding of these are potentially quite an impact with noise and the injection of concentrated pollutant from the tunnel, i.e. diesel fumes, and considering the prevailing winds and potential impacts on community. Do you think we've adequately covered those? Because I recall distinctly a discussion with a representative from ARTC probably 2 years ago, and I raised these matters where they were proposing to have some of these. And I note they've changed location, but I'm still concerned that that has not anywhere near adequately been addressed. And given the potential for major infrastructure like this to create a divide between a north and south community, and dare I say Brisbane with the Brisbane River, where this is a man-made, we already have a bypass, we're going to have potential impacts from these exhaust stacks. We could experience some detrimental effects long term into the future.
I wonder if I could just call on Lucas, thank you, to provide some technical comment there.
Thanks, Lucas.
Thanks, Councillor Carl. Yes, we have considered, I guess, in reviewing the EIS, looking at their assessment of the point source emissions from a stack. At this stage, we don't have any significant concerns around that. We're sort of relatively comfortable with the work that's been done there. The noise from the stacks has been considered as well. It's less of a concern at this point. I guess the main concern around noise is from the rolling stock itself. And yeah, that's at this stage, and I guess the sleep disturbance is the main concern we have. I guess that comes back to the criteria that's being used to assess sleep disturbance. ARTC's or proponents' findings suggest that sort of 20 to 30 houses may be affected during the operational phase by with sleep disturbance. They might experience noise levels that are too high, but I guess we don't agree with the criteria they're using, and we think there's better, more current and internationally recognised criteria which they refer to but then don't really use. If you use that criteria from the World Health Organisation, would suggest it's more like 600 houses that will be impacted. So I guess there's an order of magnitude difference between what the proponent predicts will be impacted by. Their sleep will be disturbed, 20 versus 600.
Another one.
Councillor Carl?
Yeah, so I'm not just thinking about now, and that's a big difference, by the way, isn't it?
Yeah.
20 to 600 on World Health Organisation standards. That alone is alarming. But why I'm concerned about the location of these stacks is in relation to the future and future settlement pattern and pressure that will come on that interurban break, as it's so called now, with potential pressure from development. So we could be experiencing a lot more than 600 houses into the future that may be impacted. And this sort of thing could potentially sterilise the use of land in the future to accommodate sensible growth.
One of the issues we've identified in the air quality assessment is that the stack assessment doesn't appear to consider future uses. So sort of looking at existing receptors, what happens in the future with land use planning and whatnot. So yes, it's a fair point around, does it squash future uses in a certain area?
Councillor Summerfield?
Thanks, Chair. So in here, there's mention of Q fever, and I'm not sure who should be handling this, but I know transmission begins when it becomes airborne through faecal matter, which is often very wet on on trucks and trains and whatever, but if there is potential for it to dry out, I guess it can become airborne. But there's no mention in there about the distance that it can actually travel when it's airborne, and I just wondered whether that's actually been looked into, what the current arrangements is whether cattle come on our current train tracks, or I just wondered.
I guess I can't speak on behalf of current arrangements with existing stock movements. But yes, in the more detailed response, we've had a look at, there's various studies from around the world and within Australia that show Q fever does get transmitted along stock haulage routes. It would be through the dust coming off the livestock trains, and I suppose if there's not appropriate cleaning to keep them from having dry matter build up, you've got a high-speed train moving at 115 k's an hour or whatnot. There is potential for this, and it can. There's various studies that show that you can be impacted within sort of anywhere from up to 5 to 10 kilometres. There's been plenty of studies showing that it's quite a wide potential for distribution. It's just something we think at least needs to be considered, probably with consultation with Queensland Health.
That's a long way, 5 to 10 kilometres. That would just about rule out every corridor, whether it be truck or train. Thanks.
Any other questions in regard to air and noise submission? Nothing else. Thank you, Elizabeth. We've got landscape and visual amenity.
Thank you. So the final key issue that we're raising here this afternoon with you, Council, is around landscape and visual amenity. And one of the key aspects of this that I'd like to talk to you about is a permanent spoil stockpile, which is proposed at the Western Tunnel portal. And the estimated dimensions are 600 metres by 200 metres and up to 7 metres tall. So it's approximately the size of 15 football fields. This would be a significant new visual feature in the existing landscape, and the draft EIS provides no meaningful visualisations or descriptions of proposed mitigation measures for this spoil stockpile. And we have been very clear in our submission to say that Council does not accept that a permanent stockpile is an appropriate solution for spoil management. And it should be pointed out that this spoil stockpile would just be from the construction of the tunnel. There would be other spoil that would be generated as part of the project. And overall, Council has provided some various issues and various recommendations in the submission that the proponent is to come up with some different ways of using this spoil, and that stockpiling it is not an acceptable outcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Any comment there? Councillor Shine?
Just on that point, does council have any suggestions for them in relation to the use of that stockpile?
So I understand that some conversations have been had in terms of road fill for a small amount of that spoil. And I guess it's important to note that the spoil that would be coming from the tunnel, we're actually not sure of what exactly the material is going to look like or is going to consist of. So that would be a bit tricky.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Shine? You're comfortable with that?
What you're saying is until a further exploration.
Extract it,
you don't really know the use of it.
Councillor Carroll?
Thank you, Mr Chair. If you look at the trial tunnel that was underneath the bypass and had 3 or 4 trips down there, it is fractured basalt and there is a lot of moisture in it, so it'd be interesting. But one thing, regardless of all that, I don't think that's anywhere near acceptable at all. And regardless of the use of it, it's not our issue, it's their issue, and it shouldn't be put there.
And also, it's not just where it goes and how it can be used, but it's the haul routes that are needed to take it there.
Any other questions in regard to that? Fairly strong submission in that way. Elizabeth, did you want to continue on then with the presentation? They're the main issues that have come through.
That's correct. So they're the sort of key issues that we have pulled out and presented in the cover letter of the submission, and then obviously it goes into a considerable amount of more detail in the actual submission. Just wanted to end by saying the Office of the Coordinator General expects our submission on the 25th of October, and that the 2 recommendations that are put forward to you this afternoon, Council, is that 1, that Council endorse the submission on the draft environmental impact statement for the Inland Rail project Gowrie to Helidon, and that we make its response to the Coordinator General on or before the 25th of October. And number 2 here is that council delegate the authority to the CEO to amend and action any changes to the submission based on feedback received from technical officers and councillors as a result of this special meeting.
Questions? Councillor Nancy?
Thank you. If I could just go back to the soil one for a minute, I just had a thought that that's a significant amount of soil, and whether it be on flat ground or terraced ground that it's actually left, that will have an impact on water flow, whether in a rain event or whatever. And what would that mean for surrounding areas when you have that amount of soil pile there that it could change a water flow and impact property as well?
Correct. And perhaps, Elizabeth, did you want to make comment on that, or even Mike from an overland flow path, perhaps? But I guess that's the reason for the submission, is to not have it or have an alternate use. So that would be one of the items that's been raised. Exactly.
That's correct.
Yeah. Any other questions, councillors, in regard to the submission? If there's no other questions, before we put the recommendation to vote, it's worthy, and we should acknowledge the work that Elizabeth has done and her team in regard to putting the submission together, because it's an enormous task, and it's the first chance, as I said earlier, councillors, that we've had the opportunity publicly to actually talk about this section of the Inland Rail. And there's an enormous amount of work being done by council officers, and today we acknowledge that by way of this submission. Councillor Carl, you had a question?
Yeah, question through you, Chair. To you, Elizabeth. Based on the feedback from around the table today, do you foresee any additions, changes to the recommendation, to the submission?
I think we could certainly look to strengthen council's position around groundwater and the use of water for construction purposes. So we might look at potentially some of the wording around there was the feedback that I received from Councillor Summerfield.
So,
I think the wording was around a zero tolerance to usage or loss of water that's used, was basically, to put it in a sentence, was around it.
And I sort of pick a couple of other, well, at least one other topic was the spoil out of the tunnel, and from goodness knows wherever that else that comes, and also the noise. I'm happy if you think that's substantial enough, but how we might strengthen the wording around potential sterilisation of that land, and it should be rated as best practice World Health Organisation standards, noise, emissions and pollution, considering the potential impact on growth corridors for TRC in the future. But I guess could council just be councillors just be CC'd in on those amendments, not to hold it up, but just so we're on the same page as to how those pieces are strengthened, please. Is that all right?
Well, perhaps even if and I'll seek some advice from the CEO, but perhaps those 3 things that we've raised there might be added in the motion to, because this obviously is submission needs to go in on Monday, just to add those 3 elements, and then delegate obviously the CEO to ensure those things go into the wording is correct from an officer perspective. What's that, Ron? Sorry? Amended attachment 2. You'll amend the attachment 2. You don't need those items put forward. We've made note of those. And it's certainly been recorded as well. So that's a reference point. So, Councillor Carl, you're comfortable? Councillor Nancy? Okay. Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, and the team involved. Councillor Megan?
Thanks, Mr Chair. Thanks, Elizabeth, from me as well. Just going back to the talk about the spoil, is it appropriate in this process to, I think where Councillor Shine would be getting at, is to be able to have some way of being offered that to the council or whatever. Is that not appropriate in this process to be sort of mentioning that, or some, you know?
Elizabeth, Mike, General Manager of ISG, Mike Brady might make comment to this one at this stage. It's a good question. Councillor Megan. Thanks, Mike.
Yes. Simple answer is yes. There's a lot of conversation happening in respect to that we don't want the spoil just left in a heap there. And the other element to this, and this is, as I said, we've also got the B2G project, which is being done separately. And there's an opportunity for a lot of this material to actually be used for embankment material in the B2G project, particularly between in the vicinity up over the Warrego Highway. So I think the scale of this mountain that they want to build, so to speak, will diminish as other uses do come to hand. We've also tagged a few thoughts around things such as even community infrastructure. If they were to do Boundary Street North, obviously there's a fair bit of embankment work there to go in there and would need material. And also even where we head with the Charlton Sports Park, the type of design there at the moment is still in very early days, and if they were to take a positive liking to that project, you could have a project where things were built on fill rather than excavation and, you know, cut and fill sort of approach. So there is opportunities in the area there that they could, you know, partake in, where that material could be effectively used. And we've made that a pretty strong statement on that a couple of times within the IS document.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, Chair, I'm happy to move when we get to it. Thank you.
Happy to move. Okay. Councillor Shine, you had your hand up.
Just in relation to the point that, somewhat relevant to the point Mike was saying, but bearing in mind the number of football fields and the height of that, where that residue is to be stored, would that have a likely effect on, and it might have been approached before too, but would it have a likely effect on possible flooding of Kingsthorpe, Gowrie Junction area? Would it exacerbate that issue?
That hits exactly the core of Councillor Summerfield's comments before, so if you want to reinforce that, Mike.
Currently the location they've shown is outside of the floodplains, so it's actually very much adjacent right to the tunnel portal. So I think it'd have a negligible impact on the broader catchment. There may be some localised impacts, but that would be more to the effect of whatever the final road network is there. Thanks.
That's covered your question, Councillor Shine. Okay. We have a mover in Councillor O'Hara-Sullivan, seconded by Councillor Carol Taylor. Those in favour? Motion's carried. That concludes the special meeting of Council. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Elizabeth, once again, and thank you to everyone involved.